Hi everyone, welcome back to PolyCloud YouTube channel. In this video, we will continue our Azure journey with next module, that is Microsoft Entra ID users and Entra Connect. You will learn step by step how to manage Entra ID user, configure security features like MFA, and set up Entra Connect for hybrid identity integration, all with practical hands-on demo. Make sure you have watched the previous video which covers the part like managing Microsoft Entra ID. It is having 3 videos, okay, and this video is going to be Entra ID user and connect, in which we are going to cover below 3 points. All this come under manage Azure identities and governance in the exam syllabus that we are looking into. There will be 2 or 3 more topics under manage Azure identities and governance, which we are going to check further. So let's get started with this video.
Managing users is a core skill for success as an Entra ID administrator. Creating users and assigning them to groups allows an administrator to provide a more streamlined and secure experience for users. Synchronizing existing user accounts for cloud resource access saves time for cloud technicians. In this course, I'll cover how to create Entra ID users using the portal, the CLI, and PowerShell. I will then cover how to perform a bulk import to efficiently create users. Then I will invite external users to partake in Entra ID, and I will enable self-service password reset. Next, I will configure identity protection and multi-factor authentication, or MFA, and I will block and unblock user accounts. I'll then explore Entra Connect Sync. This course can be used to prepare for exam AZ-104, Microsoft Azure Administrator. This demo, we'll be taking a look at how to create Entra ID user accounts within an Entra ID tenant. Specifically, we're going to be doing it in this case using the portal. We'll take a look later on at how to create user accounts using the CLI and as well using PowerShell commandlets. But here, let's focus first of all on the portal. Now, you can either be in the portal like I am here, where you can then, of course, navigate in the left-hand navigator down to your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And from here, you could go to Users. And this is where you'll get a list of existing users. You could create new users. Let's not forget, if we go back to our Entra ID tenant, we can also click Manage Tenants and switch to a different tenant if we've created other ones within our Azure account. But that's using the portal GUI. Let's not forget that we also have the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. So where the portal.azure.com, the Entra Admin Center is at entra.microsoft.com. So from here, as long as you've signed in, you'll be able to go to Identity over on the left, where you'll be able to go to Users. And then I could click, for example, All Users. What I'm seeing are the same list of user accounts we had in the portal, because it's really the same Entra ID tenant, just a different admin interface. Of course, we could also click New User from here. So I'm going to go back to the portal, navigate back to my Entra ID tenant, go to the Users view, and I'll create a user from here. So I'll click the New User button at the top. And notice we also have the option of inviting external users, for example, through email. That would be applicable if you had external contractors or temp workers or that kind of thing, where you didn't want to create an actual account for them directly in your Entra ID tenant. But we're not doing that in this case. I'm going to create new user to create an account directly in this tenant. So I'll specify the user principal name, which really looks like an email address for sign-in, the UPN. So in this case, I'll use L. Brenner. Then we have @ and then we can select the DNS domain suffix. So if you've created custom DNS domains, they'll be in this list. So you choose whichever DNS suffix that you want to work with. You can specify the display name for the account, so we'll go ahead and fill that in. It auto-generates a password, which you could view. You could also copy and convey to the user, or you could specify a different password. Using the same default password for all newly created accounts is not a good idea from a security perspective. So I'll go ahead and copy that. I'll click Next for properties. Depending on how your environment works, you might want to fill out some or all of these properties. An example of which would be if you're going to be using dynamic user groups, which look at the properties of a user to determine group membership, well, then you would fill all this stuff in as required, or at least the items you need. For example, if this user is in the sales department, maybe I'll fill in sales, and we might have a dynamic group that looks at the department attribute, and if it equals sales, they're a member of the sales group. Down at the very bottom, I'm also going to specify a usage location because with some product licenses, you need to have a usage location specified. I'm going to go ahead and click Review and Create, and I'll click Create to create the user account. It won't take very long, and you might have to click the refresh button to see them in the list. So there's the new user we just created, Lucas Brenner. And if we were to flip back to the Entra Admin Center, it's really the same underlying tenant. So if I click the refresh button, we're going to see Lucas Brenner here as well. Let's go ahead and try to log in as that newly created user account. Now remember, to do that, we need to have the user principal name, which looks like an email address. Now in this case, I'm going to test signing into the myapps.microsoft.com webpage where users can sign in using their Entra ID credentials and then have access to apps that they've been given permissions to use. Of course, if this user is another Azure technician, maybe we would test it out by logging into portal.azure.com, whatever the case might be. This is the URL we will use in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and specify the UPN for Lucas Brenner, the user we just created, and I'll click Next. And I'll enter in the temporary password that was auto-generated, and then I'll click Sign In. It wants me to update my password. That's the default behavior. This is a good thing. So I'll enter the current password, and I'll create a new password and confirm it. And after a moment, we're signed in to the myapps.microsoft.com site. And of course, in the upper right, there's Lucas Brenner signed in with the account. Now let's go ahead and go through that process of creating a user in the tenant, except this time we're going to use the Entra Admin Center. So I'm still in my All Users view, so there's my user accounts. I'm going to go ahead and click the New User button, and just like in the portal, we also can invite external users. I'll just click Create New User, and at this point, it's really pretty much the same thing, but let's follow through and just make sure we can successfully create a user in this GUI interface. So I'll create user M. Lin. That will be Marcia Lin. I'll let the password be auto-generated. And in this case, I'm not going to change any other properties as I just want to go through the creation process in this interface. So I'll choose Review and Create and Create. And just like that, we will have created our user, Marcia Lin. Now, if you only have to create one user or perhaps a small number of users, using the GUI might make sense. It might be your preferred method of doing it. But we'll be taking a look later also at how to use command line tools to make users. That might be helpful if you need to create a number of users. And of course, you can also import users from an import file, which is definitely the preferred way of getting user accounts created when you need to create a large number of user accounts. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using the Azure CLI to create a user account within an Entra ID tenant. So the first thing I'm going to do is launch the Cloud Shell here from within the Azure portal where I'm already authenticated. Now I'm doing this because I can access the CLI here through Cloud Shell. You can also use the CLI on your on-premises computer if you've gone ahead and installed it, as we've done an example of earlier. In this case, I'll click the Cloud Shell icon. Because I'm doing this through the portal, I won't have to authenticate as I am already authenticated in the portal. Once I'm in here, I can run AZ help to try to get help on the next level commands after the AZ prefix that I would use if I wanted to manage user accounts. So if I go back up to the help, the next level subgroup, so it means the next thing I would type in after AZ and a space would be, for example, AD for Azure Active Directory. Even though the CLI still calls it that, we know, of course, that means our Entra ID tenant. So if I clear the screen and run AZ-AD help, so take it a step further, so I can also run AZ find, and in double quotes, I want to see if we've got AZ-AD user as a valid command. So I'm guessing that user would be the next logical thing. And sure enough, it looks like it's correct. It's returning help on how to run AZ-AD user create and then passing various parameters like display-name and the password, the user principal name or the UPN, the email sign-in essentially. So I'm going to clear the screen and I'm going to run AZ-AD user list so we can see which accounts we currently have in our tenant. Now, it returns all of the properties for each of the accounts, so we can pare it down a little bit by using the up arrow key to go back through our previous command history. And what I want to do is just add to the end of our previous command, --query, space, open close square bracket. The open close square bracket simply references there's a collection, like multiple users in this case. And what I want from each user it will cycle through is the dot display name attribute. Display name is case sensitive, a small d for display, but a capital N for name. Actually, let's try this out by putting in name in all lowercase, and I'll press enter. So all it returns is an open and close square bracket. It returns nothing. Naturally, that's not what we're looking for. But if I put display name with the capital N for name, well, then we get back the desired result. So we have a list of our user accounts in our tenant. I'm going to create a new user by the name of Janice Carter. So J Carter. We don't have that account in there already, so that's perfect. AZ-AD user create -- display -name. And in double quotes, I'm going to put in Janice Carter, close double quotes, -- password. I can set it to an initial password of my choosing. And I'll then specify -- user -principal -name. And I'll specify in this case J Carter at, and I'll use my default DNS domain suffix for my tenant. There are other parameters we could optionally specify, but I'm going to go with this. I'll press enter. Okay, it returns back some JSON output. JSON is JavaScript object notation. That's the syntax used here. Anyways, it looks like it created the account. We can verify our work by using the up arrow key to go back up through our command history. Remember we ran AZ-AD user list with the -- query parameter asking for the display name attribute or property? Let's do that again. This time, notice that Janice Carter shows up in the list. If I were to minimize Cloud Shell and navigate here in the portal, let's say, to my Entra ID tenant here in the GUI, go to users. As I'm sure is no surprise to you, there's user Janice Carter. Back here in Cloud Shell, I'm now going to run AZ-AD user show. So I want to show some details about our new account. I'll do that by using the --ID parameter and supplying the user principal name for that account. When I press enter, I get back some return details like the business phone number, the display name, the job title, mobile phone number, surname, and so on. Let's minimize this. Let's open up the properties of Janice Carter here in the portal. Let's go to groups on the left. So she's a new user and we didn't specify that she should be a member of a group. Let's just go ahead and add her to a group. I've got an existing group here called test. I'm just going to select it. And if I click refresh, after a moment, it shows that she is a member of that group. Back to Cloud Shell. Clear the screen. I'll run AZ-AD group list -- query. And then I'll specify I want the display name for the groups. There's the test group. And finally, I can run AZ-AD group member list -- group. I want to look at the members of the test group and I'll query for the display name attribute. And sure enough, it returns that our user, Janice Carter, is a member of that group. And of course, there might be times when you need to remove a user account. So let's take a look at how we can do that with the CLI. Here I'm going to run AZ-AD user delete, no surprise there, --ID, and once again, I've specified the user principal name or the UPN. So I'll press enter, and no news is good news. The user has now been removed. We can verify this by using our up arrow key to go back through our command history to where we were listing users and showing their display names. Janice Carter, of course, is no longer in the list. All right, well, we've seen how to create users in the GUI and also using the Azure CLI. So now it's time for us to take a look at how we would accomplish the same thing, but using PowerShell. You can run PowerShell on your local computer on premises if you've installed the Azure module But in this case, I'm just going to launch PowerShell within Cloud Shell from within the portal. So I've already signed into the portal, so I'm going to go ahead and click the Cloud Shell icon up at the top, and I'll maximize it. Now that took us into Bash, which is the last thing I happened to have been using here, but what I want to do is click that and switch it over to PowerShell, and I'll click Confirm to do that. Now bear in mind, PowerShell has become quite mature. It was first introduced by Microsoft way back in 2006, but ever since then, it's grown exponentially to the point where it runs on a multitude of platforms. You can run it on the Mac OS, on Linux, on Windows, and there are many third-party vendors, hardware and software vendors, that have created PowerShell modules, which contain commandlets, that you can run against their products to manage them, like VMware, for instance. So the point is that PowerShell has become very popular and is widely used. First thing I want to do is run git -command and *AZ*user*. The asterisk is a wildcard. It could stand for any number and any type of character, but I'm guessing that the name of the PowerShell commandlet that will allow me to work with users has AZ in it for Azure and user for user. So I'll press enter. Well, we definitely have a lot of stuff returned. One notable item shown in the list in the ends is the new -AZAD user. AD being Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. Even though it's been rebranded as Entra ID, some of the commandlets and also CLI commands still refer to Azure AD. That's fine, as long as we know. The first order of business here before creating a user account is I want to set the password, but I want to store it in a memory variable securely, not clear text. So I'm going to create a variable here in PowerShell called $secure string password. It could be called whatever I want it to be called. But it will equal the result of running convert to -secure string. That's the name of the PowerShell commandlet. -string. So I'll specify my password in quotations, whatever it happens to be. Then I'll add the -as plain text and -force parameters, and I'll press enter. If I were to type in $secure string password to show what's in that memory variable, it doesn't return the password because it's not stored as plain text. Instead, it returns the data type, system.security.secure string. Good. I want to create a new user called Janice Carter, or J Carter for short. To do that, I'll run new -AZAD user -display name. In quotes, I want her display name to show as Janice Carter -user principal name. In quotes, I've got J Carter at and then my Entra ID tenant DNS domain suffix. -password, well, here I'm just going to pass it our $secure string password variable that we established above. -mail nickname, I'll just put in J Carter and I'll press enter. So it looks good. It returns back the user. So I'm going to check that with get -AZAD user, and it returns back things like the display name. Of course, there's Janice Carter, the ID, among other things. But if you really want to, you can pare it down. So if I use the up arrow key to go back to get -AZAD user, where in the CLI you can use -- query to filter out the returned results, here in PowerShell I can use the pipe, the vertical bar symbol, and pipe the results of the command to the left to whatever I put after or to the right of the vertical pipe symbol. I'm going to use select, and I'm going to tell it I want the display name attribute. Now, attribute names are not case sensitive in PowerShell like they are in the CLI. Okay, so now all we're looking at is what we really want. We just want the display names. And of course, Janice Carter is showing in that list. Now let's say I want to modify some aspect of Janice Carter's account. The first thing I'll do is store her UPN in a variable. Of course, in this case, I'm going to call that variable $UPN, and it will equal the UPN of that account. And I'll press enter. I'm going to create a variable here called $city, and it will equal, in quotes, Milan. That's in Italy, of course, because I want to update Janice Carter's city to reflect that she works in Milan. So I can use the update -AZAD user commandlet, specify the -UPN or object ID parameter. I'm going to give it the $UPN variable. And in this case, what I want to modify about that user is -city. I'll just provide the $city variable and I'll press enter. So if we were, for instance, to minimize Cloud Shell here, and in the portal, let's go into our Entra ID tenant and go to the users view. So there's Janice Carter. If I click to open her up and click on properties along the top, over on the right for the city attribute, notice we have a value of Milan. When you need to create a large number of user accounts at the same time in your Entra ID tenant, one option is either to use command line tools and perhaps have a scripted solution, have the commands stored in a script and then just invoke the script. That'll work, but you can also import users from a properly formatted file. And so that's what we're going to look at here. Let's start here in the portal by first navigating to our Entra ID tenant, and let's go to the All Users view. So Users, All Users. Now we know about creating the New User button where we can create a new user directly in our tenant. There's also an option to invite external users through an email message, but what I'm really interested in here is going to bulk operations. We can do a bulk create. That's when you want to create the accounts directly within your Entra ID tenant. You can do a bulk invite, as I'm sure you would guess. Do a bulk email invitation for a number of users, maybe if you've started a business partnership with an external company and you want those users to be part of your tenant, maybe to access some cloud-based apps. And of course, you've got bulk delete if you need to perhaps remove the accounts for that business partner in the future. At any rate, when I go to bulk create, the way that this works is I would start by downloading the comma-separated value or the CSV template. Well, that's great. We don't have to refer to help or anything like that to see the format of that import file. We can just download a template, which I'm going to do. So I'll click download. Okay, now I've downloaded it. It's a .csv file on my computer. CSV files happen to be associated with the Microsoft Excel program. It doesn't have to be. It might be associated with WordPad or whatever. Makes no difference. So when I open up that template in Excel, then what I get in cell A1 is the version, so v1.0, and then I've got all of these column headings. Now I can also just select the column headings here and then double click one of the lines separating them to expand it out so I can read them. So we got the display name, that's required. We've got the user principal name, the UPN, of course, that's required. The initial password, required. And then whether we want to block sign in, the first name, the last name, and so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and fill out a couple of examples here. Maybe I'll add 3 users that we can then import into our tenant. Okay, so I've added 3 users along with the user principal names or the UPNs, initial passwords, and I've filled in only the first and last name attributes. You can fill all of the other attributes out, or if you're dealing perhaps with an export file from some other IT system, it might have already populated everything else, or you can just change those properties later as needed. At any rate, I'm going to save this user create template file so I can import it into my Entra ID tenant. So back here in the portal, we left off on step 1, where I downloaded the CSV template file. I've done step 2, I've edited it and saved it. Now I want to upload it. So I'll go ahead and click the Select a File button to the right of that field. Now, if I haven't satisfied all of the mandatory requirements, it's not going to be shy in telling me. Take a look. It says that we've got a file that's not valid because we're missing a property that's required. It would be the block sign in, the account enabled, either yes or no. Oh, well, we better go back and set that. So back here in my import file, yes, the block sign in, yes, no, account enabled column, in fact, is required. So for block sign in, I'm just going to set those to a value of no. Okay, let's try it again. This time, we don't have the red error message. Instead, it just says file uploaded successfully. Let's go ahead and run it. Let's do the import. So I'll click the submit button. It says click here to view the status of each operation. Oh, for sure. And I can keep refreshing this until such time that the completion time, the date and the time, is populated. Now, when you have long jobs, this can be useful, but for a short job like that, not really necessary. But if we go to the All Users view, we've got our new users created. There's Dana Powell, Emily Novak, and Amber Montoya. Those are the 3 users that were created through our import file. If I click to open up any one of their properties, notice for account status, it is enabled. Be careful how you interpret the column headers here. Block sign in, yes or no? Well, that makes sense. No, don't block sign in. But then it says account enabled. Well, does this mean account enabled is no? That's not what it means in this case. So that's a little misleading. Just watch out for that in that column heading. I've got a second import file with different user accounts here because I also want to see how this works when we use the Entra Admin Center. So back in the Entra Admin Center, in the left-hand navigator, I'm already down under Users, All Users. Of course, I have a list of my user accounts currently in my tenant here. What I want to do is click Bulk Operations, Bulk Creates, really the same interface, just done through the Entra Admin Center. I'll select my file, and the file uploaded successfully. Let's go ahead and submit. Go ahead and close this with the X. After a moment, if we click refresh, because it's only a handful of users, the new users will show up in the list. For example, Chen Lin, Gina Ortiz, and of course, if we click up in our bell notification icon in the upper right, the bulk operation, of course, succeeded. In this demo, we're going to take a look at how to manage external users that you want to invite to participate in your Entra ID tenant. As we've mentioned, this can be useful if you are perhaps working with outside contractors, so you can send them an email invitation, which they could then use as a way of being authorized to use cloud-based apps that you might have had configured or made available in your Entra ID tenant. Here in the portal, if I were to expand the left-hand navigator and go down to Microsoft Entra ID, you might recall that we've got an Enterprise Applications view. We can have a number of applications here, and if we were to go into any one of them, one of the many things we can configure in the properties of the app by clicking Users and Groups on the left are the users and groups that should have access to the app, which can include external users without you actually duplicating and creating an account for them within your tenant directly. Okay, so this all sounds great. How do we do it? Let's go back to our Entra ID tenant and let's go to the users view. I've already got quite a few users here, but what I want to do is invite an external third party. In my particular case, that's going to be an account called IT_demo_1@outlook.com. I'm in that user's mailbox, but notice there is no new email. Well, there will be once we complete the invitation. So back here in the portal, in the All Users view, I'm going to click the New User button, but I'm going to choose Invite External User. If you prefer to use the Entra Admin Center instead, in the same view in there, you would do the same thing. You would click New User, Invite External User. Doesn't matter where you do it from, of course not. So back here in the portal, I'm going to specify the email address of the external user. And I'll specify a display name, send an invite message. Okay, so I can type in a brief welcome message that they will see in the invitation. We can CC another account, maybe a department manager or a project manager, whatever the case is. I could click Next Properties and fill out a lot of the additional properties as required. But notice that the user type here is set as a guest. That means guest relative to our Entra ID tenant, as opposed to a direct member created in the Entra ID tenant. I'm not going to change that. I'm going to leave everything as it is, and I'll click Review and Invite, and I'll click Invite. Now, if I click Refresh, notice that the account IT-Demo1 does show up here in the tenant, but shows up as a guest. Let's go check the email account for that user. Okay, so I didn't even refresh the inbox. The message is already showing here. It says Microsoft Invitations on behalf of Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps is the name of my Entra ID tenant. If I click on it to open up the email message, the message I specified here, hi there, as per our business partnership, you are now a part of the family, shows up here. So the user can choose to accept the invitation. So I will go ahead and click on that button. That opens up a new web browser window where the user is prompted to accept the fact that permissions will be requested by the Entra ID tenant to receive profile data, collect and log your activity, use your profile data and activity data. Okay, let's go ahead and click Accept. And what that does is automatically redirects the user to myapplications.microsoft.com. So back in our tenant, why don't we assign that user to an application? So in my tenant properties, I'll go to enterprise applications, let's say Cisco WebEx, that's already been added here. I'll click Users and Groups on the left. I'll add a user and group. I'll click the link to select one. And notice that even external users are selectable here, in addition to members of the tenant. Okay, I'll select that account, and I'll click the Assign button, and it's done. It may take a few moments for that to be reflected back here on the app's dashboard. And after a few minutes, there's the Cisco WebEx application showing up for user IT Demo 1. So notice that the user sign-in here is their original email address. It is not tied to the Azure DevOps tenant in terms of the DNS domain name suffix. While everyone else has a different DNS suffix, at least the members of this tenant do, notice that the external user simply retains their original email address. Now, what's tacked onto it here in the properties is ext for external, and then, of course, we have the DNS suffix for the tenant, but the user doesn't have to sign in this way. They just sign into their email as usual, and as we saw, they can then get access to cloud-based apps that they've been given permissions to through the Entra ID tenant. Okay, and lastly, when we go into the All Users view, notice we could also have gone to Bulk Operations Bulk Invite, downloaded the CSV template, added email addresses to it, uploaded it, and done a mass invitation. So when you have a lot of users you need to do that for, that remains an option. In this demo, I'm going to be managing self-service password reset, which is otherwise just called SSPR. What it boils down to is giving users the ability to reset their own forgotten passwords. What this will do then is reduce the burden on the help desk and let them perhaps focus on more pressing tasks. I've switched to a different Azure Entra ID tenant for this example. So the first thing I'm going to do in the properties of my Entra ID tenant is go to the users view, where I've got a user by the name of Cody Blackwell. What we know so far is that we can click on the properties of the user, and there's a button at the top here when you're in the overview page that says Reset Password. Okay, so yes, a technician can go ahead and do this. You might even organize users into an administrative unit, as we talked about previously, and then delegate administrative access, perhaps for resetting passwords, to only the users in your tenant's administrative unit. But that's not really the focus here. We talked about those already. The focus here is how do we get users to reset their own passwords? Well, the first thing I'll do is just go back to my list of users here in my Entra ID tenant. On the left, under the Manage heading in the Navigator, notice we have an option called Password Reset. If I click on that, currently, for being enabled, it's set to a value of none. There's a little note that says, admins are always enabled for self-service password reset and are required to use two authentication methods to reset their password. Okay, well that makes sense because admin accounts are very powerful. What we're going to do here is start by clicking Selected. When you choose Selected for enabling self-service password reset, you can then go down and select these specific groups that you already have in your Entra ID tenant. I'll click the X in the upper right to close that. If you click All, it means what it says. It would apply to all of the users in your Entra ID tenant, including future ones that you add, of course. I'm going to leave that option on, and I'm going to click Save. So it says in the upper right, it's saving my password reset policy. It's been saved. Well, we need to go ahead and test this. So we're going to test it by attempting to sign in as our user, Cody Blackwell. So if I open up the properties, there's a custom DNS domain name suffix here of quick24x7 testing.info. So basically, I'm going to copy the user principal name. And maybe I'll try to sign into myapps.microsoft.com. You could try to sign into the Entra Admin Center. You could try to sign into the portal as the user. Whatever will trigger authenticating with that Entra ID account. Now, when we sign in as that user, and I'm signing in with the correct password right now, Because in order for self-service password reset to work, the user has to configure some additional information, which is what we're doing here. It says more information required. Okay, I'll click next. So it wants some phone details for my user account. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. And I'll enter a phone number, which is going to be part of the additional factor for authenticating and resetting passwords. It will have sent a verification code through text messaging, so I'll enter that code in here, and I'll click Next. And then it says verification is complete. Your phone has been registered, and that's important that this be done first. Okay, I'll click Done, and I'm going to sign back out because we want to test trying to reset our password. So I'll sign out from being logged in as Cody Blackwell. And I'll attempt to sign in with an incorrect password. So of course it's very clear in telling me it's incorrect, but I can click the Reset It Now link, which I'll do. All right, first thing I have to do is enter the characters in the picture. And then I'll click Next. So because I've set up my phone number, we can proceed with the password reset. It says enter your phone number. No problem. Okay, so it will have sent an SMS text message to my phone, so I'll just refer to my phone and enter in that code. And I'll click Next. This is great. Now it's simply asking me to enter a new password. Okay, get back into your account. It says your password has been reset. To sign in with your new password, click here. Oh, I'm definitely going to do that. So I'll select my account. I will enter my newly reset password and I'll click Sign In. And just like that, it's done. I am now successfully signed in as user Cody Blackwell, where the password was forgotten, but the user was able to reset it themselves without issuing a help desk ticket. But when you're going to deploy self-service password reset, a critical part of understanding the sequence of events is making sure that after you enable it, users sign in at least once successfully. They can't immediately begin to take advantage of SSPR if they forget their password because they haven't yet registered for it with the phone number. So back here in the portal, let's test this out. I'm going to create a brand new user. It's going to be user jgold. Display name will be Jonathan Gold. And I just want to create this account quickly, so I'll choose Review and Create. So there's user Jonathan Gold. I'll just open up that account, copy the user principal name, and let's try signing in immediately, forgetting the password. So I'm going to sign out from the myapps.microsoft.com site as Cody Blackwell, and we're going to sign in as our newly created jgold account. Next. The password is forgotten, let's say initially, so we would click Reset It Now. We're prompted then to enter the characters on the screen, so I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll click Next. But then it says, we're sorry, you can't reset your own password because you haven't registered for password reset. So that's a crucial part of understanding how this will behave in certain circumstances once you enable the feature. In this demo, we're going to take a quick peek at some Entra ID identity protection settings. So within your Entra ID tenant, you have a series of security options that will be available. So for instance, here I've signed into my Azure account in the portal, and I've navigated to a sample Microsoft Entra ID tenant. In the left-hand navigator, what we're talking about doing here is going all the way down to security. Now, when you're in the security section, on the left, you then get a new sub-navigation menu where you've got options like conditional access, identity protection, security center, and so on. Some of these items, however, for example, conditional access and having the ability to create a new policy or a new policy from a template, notice those buttons are available. Well, if they're grayed out, it's because you don't have the correct licenses assigned to your admin users in your tenant. For instance, I'm still in the properties or the navigation panel for my Entra ID tenant, where on the left, I can go to licenses. Over on the far right, I can click Manage Your Purchased Licenses. Notice that I have a Microsoft Entra ID P2 license. Now, if you don't have it, you can go and click Try, Buy. You can go down and activate a trial if you've never done it before for Microsoft Entra ID P2. Otherwise, you could just go ahead and purchase it if you've already gone through the trial and you want these advanced security features. At any rate, if I click on that license, Notice I've licensed my IT demo user, which of course is the account I'm signed in with right now. And that will allow me then as an admin to go through and manage those advanced Entra ID tenant security settings, like conditional access policies. Let's go back there. Back down to security on the left, we were looking at conditional access. We'll be looking at this in further detail a little bit later on, but here we can manage conditional access policies and, like the name implies, it conditionally determines whether someone should or should not be allowed to sign in, perhaps to access a particular cloud app. Maybe it would look at the subnet IP range they're coming in from. Perhaps it would also require multi-factor authentication. Maybe they have to be using a certain type of smartphone like an Apple iOS type of device. All of those could be conditions in a conditional access policy prior to granting access to cloud resources. You've also got options over here on the left, such as named locations, whether it's based on countries or IP address ranges. That's the example I gave a moment ago about an IP subnet range. You add the configurations here, which you can then use within a conditional access policy. If I click Authentication Strengths on the left, we've got a couple of configurations here like multi-factor authentication or passwordless MFA. You don't have to enter the password, or phishing-resistant MFA. Notice on the far right under Conditional Access Policies right now, it says not configured in any policy yet for each of these three authentication strengths. But let's go back to the security section here in the upper left in the breadcrumb trail, the links. Let's click on Identity Protection on the left. Now with Identity Protection, on the dashboard page, your landing page over on the right, you've got some stats that might be populated over time, like the number of attacks that might have been blocked, the number of users that have been protected, the number of high-risk users. There is an algorithm that will be used to determine who and who is not high risk, such as people signing in from different geographical locations that they've never signed in from before during a time of day when they normally wouldn't sign in. As we go further down, we can also view it on a geographical map of the globe to determine where the attacks appear to be stemming from. Of course, we know that with VPN anonymizers and so on, it's pretty easy to make it look like connections are coming from anywhere on the planet. However, it's a good starting point. So we know about conditional access over on the left. We've already looked at that. But we also have a user risk policy, and it's automatically set here for all users. What this will do is monitor low and above user risk. What is that? Again, user risk means determining if people are signing in from abnormal locations at abnormal times, to name but just a few factors that get checked. Azure does deem that a user is risky, in other words, it might be a compromised account, then the control section here is set to block access. Now, of course, we can go ahead and change all of these things. We could choose require password change. Instead of all users, I could click on that and select specific users and groups within my tenant, but I won't do that. Also notice here that for policy enforcement, it's disabled at the bottom. So while we can configure it, until it's enabled, it's not actually in effect. If I click Sign In Risk Policy on the left, I'll just click OK. I don't want to save any changes here. We have the same types of settings, specifically looking only at user sign-in. We've also got a multi-factor authentication registration policy we can click on the left, which by default applies to all users, but once again, you can click that and select individuals and groups from your tenant. And currently, policy enforcement is disabled, but you could enable it, which would force everybody that signs in, if they haven't already, to register for multi-factor authentication or MFA. And this is a great way to mitigate the risk of compromised user accounts that might only traditionally have used a username and a password. Single-factor authentication, MFA, is not impenetrable. However, it does add another layer of security to help protect accounts from being compromised. In this demonstration, I'll be enabling multi-factor authentication, or MFA, for Azure user accounts within an Entra ID tenant. MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is all the rage, and it has been for years. Traditionally, users signed into a system they authenticated using single-factor authentication. We're all used to this, where you supply a username and a password of some kind. And it's good to have strong, complex password policies enforced so people don't use simple, easy-to-guess passwords. However, it still falls under single-factor authentication because knowing a username and knowing a password fall under the category of something you know, which can be guessed really from anywhere in the world from an attacker with an internet connection. To make it trickier to break into accounts, so to harden them, we can enable MFA, which uses an additional login factor, whether it's a fingerprint or whether it's the requirement to have a smartphone with an authenticator app on it where a code is sent or a numeric challenge is sent. This would be in addition to knowledge of a username and a password. So definitely a harder type of thing to break into. MFA is generally recommended for all user accounts. It helps harden the environment. So here in the portal, I've navigated to my Microsoft Entra ID tenant. I'm going to go to my users view and we're going to pick a user that we'll enable MFA for. So I've got a regular user here by the name of Jonathan Gold. And if I click on that account, there's the user principal name. It looks like an email address for signing in. We can reset the password if this person forgets their password. But what we want to do is enable MFA. So I'm going to click the X in the upper right to close out of Jonathan Gold's properties. When you're in the All Users view, what you can do is click Per User MFA up at the top. That's going to open a new web browser window titled Multi-Factor Authentication, where all of your users in your tenant are shown. And of course, what's important is the multi-factor authentication status column to the far right. Here it's showing disabled for all users. Now, certainly you would want this enabled for admin type of accounts, but again, you could also enable it for regular user accounts as well. If I go back to the portal screen where we were navigating in our tenant and go back to the properties of my tenant, let's not forget that we can go down to security in the left-hand navigator. I can then go to authentication methods where, if I go to policies, we can determine the methods that can be used for authentication. For example, Microsoft Authenticator, which is an app that can be installed on a device, is currently set to no. I'm going to go ahead and select that, and I'm going to enable it. And I'm going to enable it for all users, where the authentication mode I'll leave at any. But if you wanted to configure more advanced authentication methods like passwordless login, given that you're signing in with MFA, you could do that here as well. So I'll leave it on any. I'll click Save. Okay, so the Microsoft Authenticator authentication method for all users in the tenant is now enabled. If I click User Registration Details to the left, any users that might have already supplied things like a mobile phone number will be showing here as capable under the multi-factor authentication column. Otherwise, any other users that are showing as not capable will have to provide that info the next time they sign in. If I click Registration and Reset Events on the left, in fact, we do have a record of user C. Blackwell registering with a mobile phone number, of course, so the method used is SMS text message for authentication. If I go to Registration Campaign, I can edit the settings and basically set the days allowed to snooze to 0 to force users to register. Of course, the authentication method shown down below is Microsoft Authenticator for all users. Okay, so back here, I'm going to enable multi-factor authentication for user IT demo. This is an admin account, and most certainly MFA should be turned on. We can also automate this for admins through things like conditional access policies, but here we'll just do it manually. Okay, so over on the right, now that I've selected that admin account, I'll click Enable and I'll choose Enable Multi-Factor Auth and close. What shows up here now is that it's been enabled under the multi-factor auth status column. So MFA is enabled, but it's not enforced because that user hasn't yet signed in using MFA. This has just been turned on. So what we need to do is sign out and sign back in with the IT demo account to see what happens. So I'm signing back into portal.azure.com in this particular example. I've specified the user principal name that I want to sign in with, and I've also specified the password for that account. So I'll go ahead and click sign in. All right, now it says action required. I don't have an option of skipping this. So it says your organization requires additional security information. Follow the prompts to download and set up the Microsoft Authenticator app. So I need to have my phone handy then to do that, in this case, because I'll be installing it on my Android-based smartphone. So I'll choose Next. All right, it says start by getting the app. Well, I already have the Microsoft Authenticator app installed on my smartphone from the Microsoft Store from the Google Play Store. So I'll go ahead and click Next. Set up your account. It says, if prompted, allow notifications. This is in the app on your phone, and then add an account and select work or school. Okay, I'll do that now. And on my app, I'll choose to scan in a QR code because when I click Next here, I can simply point my smartphone, because it activated the camera, to this QR code on the screen. So I'll do that now. Okay, it's activating and adding the account on my smartphone in the Microsoft Authenticator app. So I have an entry added for my IT demo account. I'll click Next. It says, let's try it out. Approve the notification we're sending to the app. So what's happening on my smartphone is the app is popping up and it's asking me to enter the number shown on the screen, which in this case is 77. So I'll go ahead and put that in and I'll tap yes on my smartphone. And then it updates here and says notification approved. Perfect. Next step. It says Microsoft Authenticator app was successfully registered. Perfect. I'll click done. Okay. Let's sign out and sign back in to see what the experience is like now that MFA is being enforced. So I'll just sign out and I'll just sign right back in. I still have to know the name and the password because I didn't specifically enable passwordless login. That's fine. I'll click sign in. Okay, so there. I have to approve a sign-in request by putting in the number 58 in the Authenticator app. The Authenticator app should automatically pop up in the foreground on your smartphone when you do that. So I'll go ahead and enter that. And here we go. We are now signed in using multi-factor authentication. So if we were to navigate to our Entra ID tenant, go to the users view, go to the per user MFA button. Notice now for the IT demo account, where before it was enabled under the multi-factor auth status column, now it's showing as enforced. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at what you can do to block or unblock user accounts. Of course, you might want to block a user account if it's been suspected that the account has been compromised. And of course, you might want to unblock it if that situation goes away. Let's take a look at how to do this. First things first, in our Microsoft Entra ID tenant, I'm going to start by going to our users view because we're going to be using the user Cody Blackwell to test this. So the absolute first thing we should do then, because it would make sense, is to make sure that person can sign in currently. So I'm going to copy the user principal name and we're going to sign in as Cody Blackwell. I'm just going to sign into myapps.microsoft.com to test this. So there's the user principal name. I'll click next and I'll specify the password for C Blackwell. I'll click sign in. And just like that, we're signed in as user Cody Blackwell. So clearly, user sign in for this account has not been blocked. Okay, well, let's go back into the portal and let's go to the properties of our Entra ID tenant, where on the left, I'm going to scroll down because as we know, all of the security stuff is hidden under security. And within that, we've got a number of second level items to choose from the left-hand navigator. I'm going to go to multi-factor authentication. And from here, I can go to account lockout. So for users that use a PIN to authenticate, after too many incorrect login attempts, we can lock the account. But we're really here to go to block, unblock users. Now notice this is under multi-factor authentication. Cody Blackwell wasn't prompted to sign in with MFA. Well, let's go back to our users view here in our tenant. Let's go to the per user MFA button and let's turn it on for Cody Blackwell. I'll put a check mark to the left of that person's name, and over on the far right, I'll click enable and I'll click enable multi-factor auth, and we're good. What we want to do is sign out as Cody Blackwell and sign back in to set this up. So back on the myapps.microsoft.com page in the upper right, I'll sign out as Cody Blackwell, and we're going to sign right back in. Okay, so it's asking to verify my identity by sending an SMS text to a phone number. So I'll select that, and I'll check my phone for that code. And I'll enter it in here. So of course, Cody Blackwell has to have already configured this phone number for it to know where to send the SMS text message. I'll click verify. Okay, here it talks about the fact that we need to use the Microsoft Authenticator. We can skip for now, but I'm just going to click next. We've seen this before, setting up MFA, so I'll just click next, next. And on my smartphone where I have the Microsoft Authenticator app already installed, I will tap the plus button to add a new work or school account, and then I'll choose to scan a QR code, and I'll just point my phone camera to this QR code. It'll activate the account. I'll click Next. It wants me to test it out here. It's giving me the number 21, and it popped up on my phone, so I'll type that in, and I'll tap Yes. And just like that, it's good to go. Okay, MFA is now set up for this user. We're going to test it, of course. So what I want to do is, once again, in the upper right, click on CB for Cody Blackwell, sign out. We'll sign back in as that same user. And of course, MFA kicked in here, so we've got to enter the code on our phone and tap Yes, and we're in. Okay, so the point is that user now is using MFA. So back in the portal, let's go back into our tenant, down into security once again, down into multi-factor authentication, unblock users. This time we're going to click Add. I'll specify the UPN for that user account. And let's just go with the standard. The user lost their phone, so we want to block their account for now. For security reasons, okay. It says it successfully blocked that user account. And then, of course, we have the option of unblocking it. Now, it might not take effect immediately, but let's go ahead and test it out. I'm going to close or sign out as C. Blackwell. And instead of the normal screen where it gives me numeric code, instead, it says request denied. Well, that's because the account is blocked. The user, in our example, has simply lost their phone. Okay, let's cancel. And back here in the portal, let's just go ahead and unblock that account. I'll put in an example. Reason, found phone. Click OK. We've unblocked that user. So now when we try to sign in again, the regular MFA stuff is kicking in. So in this case, it wants me to type in 96 in my Authenticator app. I'll do that. And just like that, we're signed back in. So it's a handy little feature for technicians to take care of a user suspects they've lost their phone, it's been stolen, or anything along those lines. It's pretty easy to block and unblock them from signing in through MFA. When it comes to managing user accounts related to the Azure cloud, we have to think about Microsoft Entra Connect. Stated simply, Entra Connect allows us to link our on-premises Active Directory, or AD, to Microsoft Entra ID, to a Microsoft Entra tenant. Now, we would do this because we would then not have to create user accounts in our Entra tenant. So there would be no user account duplication. If we've already got, for instance, hundreds of user accounts in our on-premises AD, and we want them to be able to authenticate, for instance, to cloud-based apps in Azure, this is a great solution without having to recreate all those user accounts again. But there are a couple of synchronization options we need to be aware of, one of which is called Cloud Sync. This allows for connectivity to multiple on-premises Active Directory forests, but unlike in the past Azure AD Connect, as it was called, we don't need on-premises servers. Instead, we have a cloud-based agent that talks to our on-prem AD. It's designed to be a highly available agent, and the configuration of that agent is stored in Azure, not on an on-premises server. The next option we have in terms of synchronizing on-prem AD accounts with Entra is through something called Connect Sync. This provides a few more advanced features than Cloud Sync does, and it also works a bit different architecturally. So, it supports lightweight directory access protocol, or LDAP connectivity, so it can connect to any on-prem LDAP source. And it does require an on-prem server where you can install the on-premises server agent. If you're familiar with the older Azure AD Connect feature, this is more what Connect Sync is like, where the config data, of course, would be stored then on the on-premises server because that's where the agent was installed and is running. And it supports more features than Cloud Sync, things like password hash sync, to synchronize password hashes from on-prem into the cloud, as well as options like password write back. So when a user changes their password and they're signed into their cloud account, it'll write it back to the on-prem AD. Now, when you want to link your on-premises AD to your Entra tenant, think about the custom domain name option. We know that the default DNS domain name suffix of a tenant ends with .onmicrosoft.com. what you can do is create a custom DNS domain name for your Entra tenant that matches the on-premises Active Directory domain name. Now, when you create that custom domain name in Azure, you'll have to verify that you own it by creating a record in the DNS zone with a specific value as provided by Microsoft. If we were to take a look at a diagram of the Entra Connect sync components, this is the one where we do install the agent on the on-premises server. So we would have an on-premises writable domain controller server where we install the Entra Connect agent. Now, the Entra Connect agent, once installed and configured, will make a connection into the Azure cloud. So we would have the same custom domain name in the cloud that matches the on-premises Active Directory domain name. When you're using the Azure portal, this is what it looks like when you go to enable Entra Connect Cloud Sync. So we have a screenshot for this. Remember, it can connect to multiple different on-prem Active Directory environments that links to a single Entra tenant. So there's a button to download the provisioning agent to set up Cloud Sync. In the same vein of discussion, here we've got a screenshot of the Entra Connect Sync option, where we have an on-prem server, so we can download the Connect Sync agent to install on the on-prem server, after which we would continue through the installation to connect it to our Azure environment. So really, it's the requirements for a given scenario that will dictate whether you need Cloud Sync or Connect Sync. Remember that if you're looking for simplicity without a lot of features, then you should be thinking about Connect Cloud Sync. But if you want to use some more advanced features like conditional access, you should be looking at Connect Sync. And if you're also dealing with large on-premises Active Directory domains with a lot of users, a lot of groups, a lot of members in groups, Connect Sync is designed to handle that on a larger enterprise scale than Cloud Sync is. If, for example, you choose to go with Cloud Sync, once that agent is installed, you would then configure Cloud Sync settings, which can also include things like scoping filters. Maybe you only want to synchronize users in specific groups or users in specific organizational units or OUs in your on-prem Active Directory. The focus of this demonstration is going to be getting Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync installed. What we're talking about doing here is essentially synchronizing users from an on-premises Active Directory domain environment into our Entra ID tenant. Cloud Sync uses a small lightweight agent that you install in your on-premises servers, and you can have more than one working together for high availability. Now, there's a lightweight agent on the on-premises servers, but it's managed from within Azure. It replicates any changes that might occur locally in your Active Directory environment every 2 minutes. But that's for users, not for devices that might be joined to your domain. It also doesn't support anything you might have done in your on-premises Active Directory environment, such as customized Active Directory attributes. But for basic user synchronization, Cloud Sync is a great solution. Now, I've pulled up here the prerequisites online. You can search these up in your browser for Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync. So we've got to have the appropriate credentials both for Azure and for our local Active Directory environment. We've got to be running at least Windows Server 2016 or later. And there are also a number of documented firewall and proxy requirements for things like ports 80, ports 443, and 8080. There are also a bunch of URL requirements that need to be available so that the agent can talk to the internet. Depending on your environment, this might already be in place, but it's important to at least be aware of what the prerequisites are. These are always well documented online. Okay, back here in the portal, I'm in the properties of my Entra ID tenant. So what I want to do on the left is scroll down and then click on Microsoft Entra Connect. And from here, I'll click the Manage link at the top. Now, there are two options here. We can work with Cloud Sync, which is going to be our focus, or for more advanced environments with more supported features, we can use the Connect Sync agent, which is a little more similar to the old Azure AD Connect agent. In this case, we're going to be running Cloud Sync. So what we need to do then is download the Cloud Sync provisioning agent, because remember, it's still a lightweight agent on your server. It just gets managed from the cloud. But you want to download this on the domain joined server itself. Now, when you do download that on your server, it should automatically go into your downloads folder. So if I take a look at my downloads folder, indeed, here I've got the file. It's called AAD. So it's still using the old terminology, Azure Active Directory, Connect Provisioning Agent Setup. That's an executable program. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on it and run it as administrator here on my domain controller. You don't have to do this on a domain controller, but it does need to be a server joined to an on-prem Active Directory domain. Okay, Microsoft Entra Provisioning Agent Package. I agree to the license terms and conditions. I will then click Install. Okay, on the welcome screen, I will click Next. So on the Select Extension screen, I'm interested in the first option for Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync. So I'll click Next after that. Now remember, we have to have credentials to sign in with an admin account to our Entra ID tenant, and we also have to have the on-prem AD admin credentials. So I'll specify the admin email address for my Entra ID tenant, and I'll click Next. And I'll enter in the password, and then I'll click Sign In. Because I've got MFA enabled for that admin account, and that's a good thing, I'll have to approve this sign-in request on my smartphone through the Microsoft Authenticator app. Okay, MFA is signing me in. So now I have to configure a service account that will allow for the synchronization between my on-prem Active Directory and my Entra ID tenant. So it says down below, enter your domain admin credentials. No problem. Here on my domain joined server, if I take a look at Active Directory users and computers, my domain name is shown here. It's called quick24x7testing.info. And in the users container, I've got the standard user accounts here that you might expect. Notice I have one called C. Blackwell. If I take a look at that account and click Member Of, it's a member of Domain Admins, Enterprise Admins. So that's my admin account for my on-prem Active Directory domain. So I'll specify the NetBIOS shortened version of my Active Directory domain name with a / and C Blackwell, my admin account, and then the password for that on-prem AD admin account. Okay, and then I'll click Next. Okay, looks good. I'll click Next again. And on the agent configuration summary screen, it's got my Entra ID details as well as my local on-prem Active Directory details. I'm happy with this, so I'll click Confirm. So it's creating the GMSA, that's the Group Managed Service Account to manage the synchronization, registering the agent with Microsoft Entra ID. Good. Okay. And at the bottom, it now says your agent installation and configuration is complete. Please complete all your provisioning configuration using the Microsoft Entra ID portal. Okay, I'll click Exit. Back here in Active Directory users and computers, and this is in my on-premises domain, in the Managed Service Accounts container, here we've got our provisioning agent that was created as a result of installing Cloud Sync. So naturally, don't delete this account. Back here in the portal, in the properties of my Entra ID tenant, we started this whole thing off by clicking Microsoft Entra Connect on the left. I'm going to click Cloud Sync in the left-hand navigator. That puts me into the Cloud Sync config. Remember, we manage the config from here. So what I can do is click New Configuration, and it's going to be AD, that's my on-prem Active Directory, to Microsoft Entra ID Sync. Which Active Directory domain would you like to sync? It knows about my Active Directory domain because I installed the provisioning agent and it's talking to Azure. I'll leave Enable Password Hash Sync turned on, which means it'll synchronize not the actual passwords from on-prem AD, but rather a hash of the password. That's what's going to be stored in my Entra ID tenant, which will still allow user authentication through Azure, using the same credentials that our regular user base is familiar with when they sign into their on-prem AD account. That's the whole point here. Okay, let's create the config by clicking Create in the bottom left. Okay, in our bell notification icon in the upper right, it says Cloud Sync configuration successfully saved. And sure enough, if you take a look at our breadcrumb trail and the links at the top, we're in our Entra ID tenant under Cloud Sync configurations. If we actually back out and come in fresh and take a peek at how that feels, when we go into Entra Connect, we would click Cloud Sync, and then the configuration is now showing. Notice the status is currently disabled. We've got a Review and Enable button at the top. Here's a little summary of our options. I'm going to click enable configuration. Okay, the configuration is successfully updated. So now when we view our configurations, the status ideally will show as healthy. It should be synchronizing approximately every 2 minutes from on-prem AD into the cloud. So if I go back to my Entra ID tenant and now go into the users view, you should expect to see an on-premises directory synchronization, basically a dummy account that's been created for the synchronization. You know that Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync is a solution that lets us synchronize on-premises Active Directory into our Entra ID tenant. We want to do this in some cases because we don't want to recreate user accounts that already exist on-prem in the cloud, yet we want to allow authentication through the cloud, perhaps even to cloud-based apps. Cloud Sync is a great solution for this, and it requires that we have the Cloud Sync agent installed on at least one on-premises machine, a server, joined to the appropriate Active Directory domain. Doesn't need to be a domain controller. So I am actually at an on-premises Windows server. It does happen to be the domain controller, doesn't have to be. Notice I've got the Microsoft Entra provisioning agent wizard. There's an icon there. I've already actually got it installed and running on this host. It's already syncing with my Entra ID tenant. If I were to take a look at the services running on this Windows server, in the M's, notice the presence of the Microsoft Azure AD Connect type of services. Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, of course we all know was the old name. Now it's called Entra ID, but it doesn't matter. As long as we know that these are the services that are a part of this. If I were to go back to the desktop where I installed the Cloud Sync agent and double click on that wizard icon, as I proceed through the wizard, it would let me configure the agent if I need to make changes. But this is designed to be managed from the cloud. I'm going to close out of that. Before we do that, let's just poke our heads here into Active Directory users and computers on this on-premises host. Notice that I've got an organizational unit or an OU called HQ for headquarters, and I've got an OU within it called users. I've got two users here, Alan Alford and Chantal Sands. If I go into the Azure portal, into my Entra ID tenant that I'm synchronizing with that on-premises Active Directory domain, and if I go into users, we've got the on-premises directory synchronization dummy user account, but it also synchronized Alan Alford and Chantal Sands. That's because if we kind of go back in our tenant into its properties, and if I scroll down and select Microsoft Entra Connect and then click Cloud Sync on the left, we've got our active and enabled configuration. It shows healthy here from on-prem AD, and the on-prem Active Directory domain name is shown here. It's called quick24x7testing.info. If I click on that name, it opens up the properties of my connection, where I have a host of options. For example, if I click Scoping Filters over on the left, the default selection is to synchronize all users, which is exactly what it's done. But sometimes you might want to have a subset of users from your on-prem AD synced into your Entra ID tenant. So you could choose selected security groups and go through and put in the name and add it. You could select specific organizational units or OUs. But the default behavior is all users will be synchronized. If I go to attribute mapping over on the left, we can determine a source attribute in the Active Directory domain and what it maps to in our Entra ID tenant. You can click the pencil to edit that attribute mapping, but generally speaking, the standard mappings usually work quite well. We've also got some monitoring options over here on the left, like a provisioning log. Notice the references here for some of the users that were synced, like Alan Alford, Chantal Sands. So what this means then is that because those user accounts are now present in our Entra ID tenant, let's pick on user Alan Alford. When I open up that user's property, sure enough, there's the user principal name. I should be able to sign in to cloud-based apps as that user. We didn't create that user account here. We synced it from on-premises. Let's test it out. So I'm just signing in with that user's UPN, user principal name. I'm connecting to myapps.microsoft.com. The URL has changed though. And I'll click next. Now the password, well, what do I put here? I didn't set it up in the cloud. It should have synced it through password #sync. So What's the on-prem password for that user? Enter it here, and then sign in. Now, because I require some security information for multi-factor authentication, we get this action required screen. I'm just going to choose ask later because that's not the point here. And just like that, we're signed in as Alan Alford. That account was not created in Azure. It was created in on-prem AD and synced to Azure using Cloud Sync. So in this course, we've examined how to manage Entra ID users and Entra Connect sync. We did this by exploring how to manage Entra ID users using the portal, the CLI, and PowerShell. And we also imported Entra ID users from a file and managed external users. Next, we managed self-service password reset, or SSPR. We configured Entra ID identity protection. We enabled MFA, multi-factor authentication, as well as saw how we can block and unblock user accounts. Next, we discussed the purpose of Microsoft Entra Connect, and then we installed and managed Microsoft Entra Connect Sync. In our next course, we'll be taking a look at how we can work with Entra ID groups and how to configure conditional access.